Picture this. Hollywood's toughest action star, Jason Statham, standing in a crowded martial arts gym, his ego inflated by years of blockbuster success. Across from him sits a quiet, unassuming man in his 80s, Chuck Norris. The room falls silent as Statham's voice cuts through the air like a blade. "You're too old to fight, old man. Your time is over." What happens next will leave you speechless, because sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one flexing their muscles. It's the one who's already proven everything they need to prove. This is the story of how Hollywood's cockiest action hero learned the hardest lesson of his career, and why you should never, ever underestimate the quiet strength of a legend who has nothing left to prove. The lesson Statham learned that day would change him forever. But first, let me tell you how we got there. Jason Statham was riding high. Fresh off another box office success, his latest film had just crossed the $100 million mark worldwide. The critics called him unstoppable, the real deal, Hollywood's most authentic action star. And Jason? Well, Jason started believing his own press. Walking into Elite Combat Academy that Tuesday afternoon, Statham carried himself like he owned the place. His publicist had arranged this visit, a photo op at a legendary martial arts gym in Los Angeles, designed to promote his upcoming film. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but his ego was already in performance mode. The gym was sacred ground to those who understood martial arts. Its walls held the sweat and stories of champions, the quiet dedication of masters who had devoted their lives to perfection. But Jason saw it differently. To him, it was just another backdrop for his image. He strutted through the facility, barely acknowledging the students practicing their forms with religious devotion. His eyes scanned for photo opportunities, for moments that would look good on Instagram. That's when he spotted him, an elderly man in simple white jai, moving through kata with fluid precision that seemed to defy physics. "Who's the old guy?" Jason asked loudly, his British accent carrying across the suddenly quiet gym. The question hung in the air like smoke. Students stopped their practice. Instructors exchanged glances. Because everyone in that room knew exactly who that old guy was. Everyone except the action star who thought he was the toughest man in Hollywood. "That's Chucknorris," whispered one of the younger students, his voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for meeting your childhood hero. Chuck looked up from his practice, his weathered face breaking into that familiar, humble smile that had endeared him to millions. At 83, he moved with the grace of a man half his age, but there was something else, a stillness, a centered calm that spoke of decades spent mastering not just combat, but himself. "Jason Statham," Chuck said warmly, extending a calloused hand, "I've enjoyed your films. You bring real athleticism to the roles." It was genuine praise from a genuine legend. Any other actor would have been honored. But Jason's ego had grown too large for gratitude. Instead of shaking the offered hand, he looked Chuck up and down with barely concealed dismissal. "Yeah, well," Jason replied, his voice dripping with condescension, "I do my own stunts. Real fighting, not that choreographed dance stuff from back in your day." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chuck's hand remained extended for a moment longer, then slowly returned to his side. His expression never changed, still that same peaceful smile. But something shifted in his eyes, not anger, not hurt, something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of a lesson that was about to unfold. "The martial arts have evolved since I was young," Chuck replied simply. "There's always something new to learn." But Jason was just getting started. The cameras had arrived, and he could feel their lenses on him. This was his moment to establish dominance, to show everyone who the real action star was. "Look, I respect what you did back in the day," Jason continued, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. He was playing to an audience now, the film crew, the gym members, the world that would see this footage. "But let's be honest here. You're what, 80? Fighting isn't a young man's game anymore for you. Your time is over." The words echoed through the gym like a slap. Students who had been practicing stopped completely now, some actually stepping back as if they expected lightning to strike. The disrespect wasn't just toward Chuck. It was toward everything this place represented, everything these people had dedicated their lives to mastering. Chuck's smile never wavered, but his voice carried a new quality when he spoke. Age brings wisdom, Jason. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you can see. Wisdom doesn't win fights, Jason shot back, now fully committed to his performance. He began circling Chuck like a predator, his movements sharp and aggressive. Strength does. Speed does. Youth does. Look at you. You can barely move without that old man's shuffle. It was cruel. It was unnecessary. And it was about to be spectacularly wrong. Chuck stood perfectly still in the center of the circle Jason was creating around him. To the untrained eye, he might have looked vulnerable, an elderly man being circled by a younger, stronger predator. But those who knew martial arts recognized something else, the stillness of a master who has transcended the need to prove himself through aggression. "You think you could take me?" Jason pressed, sensing what he thought was weakness. "You're too old to fight, old man." "Way too old." That's when Chuck did something that surprised everyone in the room. He chuckled, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement, as if Jason had just told a particularly good joke. "You know what, Jason?" Chuck said, his voice still calm, still warm. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm too old. But sometimes experience teaches you things that youth hasn't learned yet." Chuck's mind drifted for a moment to a different time, a different place. 45 years ago, standing in a similar gym, facing down a young challenger who thought age made him weak. That challenger had learned the same lesson Jason was about to learn, and the one before him, and the one before that. "I've been practicing martial arts for over 60 years, Chuck continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher sharing wisdom with a particularly stubborn student. "I've fought professionally. I've trained military personnel. I've dedicated my life to understanding not just how to fight, but when not to fight." Jason scoffed. "All that experience, and what do you have to show for it? A bunch of internet memes about how tough you used to be?" The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Everyone could sense something building, like the static electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. Chuck's expression remained serene, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, barely perceptible, but those who knew what to look for recognized the transition from casual observer to coiled spring. "The thing about legends, Jason," Chuck said softly, "is that they become legendary for a reason. And that reason doesn't disappear just because you get older." Jason's laugh was harsh, artificial. "Prove it, old man. Show me what a legend can do." It wasn't a formal challenge. There were no referees, no official rules, just a young man's ego colliding with an old man's quiet confidence. Chuck looked around the room at the faces watching him. These were his students, his community, people who had come to learn from him not because of his Hollywood fame, but because of his mastery. They deserved better than to watch their teacher be humiliated. More importantly, Jason deserved to learn the lesson he was so desperately asking for. "All right," Chuck said simply, "but remember, you asked for this." What happened next lasted maybe 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds would be replayed in Jason's mind for the rest of his life. Chuck didn't attack. He didn't throw a punch or attempt a kick. Instead, he did something that seemed impossible. He moved like time itself had slowed down around him. As Jason lunged forward with all the aggressive energy he'd been building, Chuck simply wasn't there anymore. It was like trying to fight a ghost. Every punch Jason threw met empty air. Every aggressive move he made seemed to flow around Chuck like water around a stone. And through it all, Chuck's expression never changed, still calm, still centered, still radiating that unshakable peace. But it wasn't just evasion. With movements so subtle they seemed like suggestions rather than techniques, Chuck guided Jason's aggression back toward itself. A gentle redirection here, a slight push there, and suddenly Jason found himself stumbling, off balance, confused about how his own momentum had turned against him. The room watched in absolute silence as Hollywood's toughest action star was systematically dismantled not by violence, but by its complete absence. Chuck wasn't fighting him. He was teaching him, showing him the difference between aggression and mastery, between posturing and true strength. Finally, with a movement so gentle it looked more like a dance step than a martial arts technique, Chuck simply placed his hand on Jason's chest. Not a push, not a strike, just a placement of his palm over Jason's heart. And Jason Statham, the man who had built his career on being unstoppable, stopped completely. Not because he was overpowered, but because he suddenly understood with crystal clarity how completely outclassed he was. In that moment of contact, Jason felt something he hadn't experienced in years: humility. It rushed over him like a cold wave, washing away the artificial confidence and leaving behind the sobering recognition of what real mastery looked like. Jason stood there, breathing hard despite barely landing a blow, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. The cameras had captured everything, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the gentle pressure of Chuck's hand on his chest and the weight of the lesson he'd just received. "I'm sorry," Jason said, and the words came out smaller than he'd intended. Not the booming voice of a movie star, but the quiet admission of a man who had just discovered how much he didn't know. Chuck's smile returned to its full warmth. "Nothing to apologize for. We all have to learn these lessons sometime. I had to learn them too, many years ago." The room slowly began to breathe again. Students exchanged glances that spoke of witnessing something profound. This wasn't just about two men in a martial arts gym. It was about the eternal dance between youth and experience, between what we think we know and what we actually understand. "The difference between you and me," Chuck said, finally removing his hand from Jason's chest, "isn't age. It's not even experience. It's that I've learned when not to fight. Real strength isn't about proving you're the toughest person in the room. It's about not needing to prove it." Jason nodded, unable to trust his voice. For the first time in years, he felt like a student again, rather than a star. It was uncomfortable and liberating all at once. "Your films are entertaining," Chuck continued, "and you are athletic. But entertainment and reality are different things. In entertainment, the strongest, youngest, loudest person wins. In reality, the person who understands themselves and their opponent wins." The cameras were still rolling, but Jason had forgotten they existed. Would you teach me?" he asked. Chuck's laugh was warm, genuine. "Teaching you would be my honor. But first, you need to unlearn the idea that you already know everything there is to know about fighting." 6 months later, Jason Statham returned to that same gym. But this time, he arrived quietly without fanfare, wearing the simple white tie of a student. He bowed respectfully to Chuck, who had become not just his teacher but his friend. The transformation wasn't just in his technique, though that had improved dramatically, but in his entire approach to strength. He learned that true martial arts isn't about defeating others, but about mastering yourself. He discovered that the most dangerous opponents are often the quietest ones, because they've transcended the need to prove their worth through aggression. Most importantly, he understood that wisdom doesn't come from youth or strength or fame. It comes from humility and the willingness to keep learning. The footage from that first day never made it to the internet. Jason had asked that it be destroyed, not out of embarrassment, but out of respect for the lesson he'd learned. Some stories are too important to be reduced to viral videos. Chucknorris continued his daily practice, his quiet mastery unchanged by the encounter. Students would sometimes ask him about that day, about the Hollywood action star who had challenged him. Chuck would just smile and say, "Everyone comes to the mat with something to learn. I was just honored to help him find it." In a world that celebrates the loudest voice and the strongest fist, remember this: the most powerful people are often the ones who have nothing left to prove. True strength lies not in dominating others, but in mastering yourself. And sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when not to fight at all. Because legends aren't made by the battles they win. They're made by the wisdom they share along the way.